second annual panel discussion that we've held to provide a capstone for the orientation for the new cohort for the HRM professional program that we've launched here at Simon Fraser University Archaeology. So we have 10 students in that cohort, as well as, I don't know how many in our traditional program this year. They are over in the archaeology department finishing their orientation. There will be a line of them coming in at some point, so you'll know that that is the rest of the new troop that is moving inside. You know, the focus here is on trying to identify some key issues in the practice and profession of archaeology, ones that unite the management portion as well as the research and outreach portions and training portions of archaeology. So this year, obviously, we've selected publications, something near and dear to everybody's heart. So John Driver here today was at some point fond of reminding folks that the real reason that universities exist, if there's one thing behind all the smoke and mirrors and various shenanigans that go on at universities and vice presidential portfolios, it's to create knowledge, to do research. And so, it's, oh, you want to try that?
Well,
oh, for advancing the pictures. Yeah. Makes sense. So, for all of us, of course, the importance of the ology part in archaeology and bioanthropology is more or less self-evident. And if you're not creating knowledge, doing it in a systematic and context-sensitive fashion, then whatever it is that you're up to, it's not archaeology or bioanthropology. So the obvious next question then is whether the ology part, the knowledge creation, is enough. And the answer, I think, embedded in this exhortative title for the panel discussion is really no, that it's not enough. And that we all agree, or should be agreeing, smiling and nodding about the idea that we need to do more than just create knowledge. We need to present it, publish it, mobilize it various ways. So that step is critically important, we think, and deserves our attention and discussion, especially in the context of new and important ways of making that presentation and publication of knowledge ever more accessible, dynamic, value-laden, useful in various ways. So here are the objectives for what I hope we will be doing, at least with some of our time together. On this first point, and again, one that should be near and dear to everybody's heart, whether student practitioner or other subcategory in archaeology or bioanthropology, should be sharing a part of, is the duty to provide information and research results from their work to colleagues and interested other parties. And of course, this is an obligation of duty that multiplies and becomes that much more important in the context of destructive analysis, especially associated with the excavation or processing of materials that can only be done one time. So the panel is also intended to bring out some discussion associated with SFU Archaeology Press, and to acknowledge the great contributions of Roy Carlson and Dean Carlson in their years of efforts to bring out some of the very best work from SFU Archaeology and SFU Archaeology's broad network of colleagues and researchers. That first phase, I guess, of SFU Archaeology Press has come to a close with Roy's recent retirement as the editor. And so we want to take a look at that and whether and how that first phase should be continued into a second phase. Goal 3, what should we do with this legacy and the assets that Roy and Maureen and all the other collaborators through the years have helped to create. So with the right blend of somewhat, and the panelists seem to be considerable talents in conversation and presentation, we'll get through these goals and maybe also some others, including this fourth one of showcasing additional capacities in open access and digital publication. So with that, I'm going to just go briefly through, and you can more or less read for yourself, the context associated with professional obligations to publish and present research results. This first one, most locally, from the BC Association of Professional Archaeologists, represented by Achini Luigi here. So it is, you know, the core part of it here is to disseminate the results of archaeological investigations without undue delay. A slightly broader, expansive view, the Canadian Archaeological Association asks its members, or requires its members, to produce an adequate document worthy of the destruction of the archaeological remains, and to recognize that documentation of an archaeological record should, within a reasonable time, become available to others. The Society for American Archaeology also asks or recommends, guides its members to produce, within a reasonable time, knowledge from the archaeological investigation and present it in an accessible form. And then finally, in the Register of Professional Archaeologists, the archaeologist has the specific responsibility for appropriate dissemination of the results of his or her research to the appropriate constituencies with reasonable dispatch. So there you go. So how do we do that? Like, not a huge number of archaeologists from previous generations can actually claim that they have dutifully discharged these responsibilities. We're emerging from a period of time in the history of archaeology when these responsibilities are now being more fully recognized and embraced. And so it still doesn't answer the question about whether or not all the different ways that we have, or the traditional modes of publishing, are adequate to the task of supporting archaeologists and bioanthropologists in doing this kind of work. So what else can and should be done? So, I guess I'm inviting your attention to my conviction that the ongoing explosion of capacities for digital and open access presentation and publication of knowledge dovetail really, really well with archaeologists' professional ethical mandates, and they also dovetail really well with this opportunity created in a certain sense to make the very best of Roy's retirement and the end of the first phase of SFU Archaeology Press, to look more carefully at what we might do. And the lure of digital publishing funds available through the library. Don Taylor, the head of the program, is here, the Scholarly Digitization Fund, available through the SFU library, as well as this convergence of ethical mandates and the Arc Press transition, I guess I'll call it, proved irresistible to me and to Aaron Hogg, who worked with me on the project, and to Kevin Strand and his crew at the library. And we have now proceeded to digitize the SFU archaeology catalog and to make it available. So that's the unveiling part of what we're doing here today. A few key attributes associated with this, just without trying to steal too much of Kevin's thunder, is to show you that this website is now available to you, or shortly will be. No, it's open. It's open. Oh, awesome. That's terrific. Promised right on time. That's really great. So you can download the entire volumes of the catalog, individual chapters, do text searching. This is all stuff that is indexed and available also through a variety of different search engines. So good news kind of all the way around really. In that sense, I wanted to ask if anybody knows what this is a photograph of. Anybody from Los Angeles here? Dave Maxwell might be the person who's most likely to know this. This is the release of water from the Calaveras Dam, the first major waterworks project in Los Angeles, and obviously the first of many, many waterworks projects. And the chief engineer, William Mulholland, said upon the release of this, "There it is, take it." And I thought these were good words to remember in terms of something like the unveiling of an Art Press catalog. What was previously sort of put away in storehouses and in boxes and available if you sent in the order form and a check, would arrive in 3 to 4 weeks, is now one click away. So there it is, world, have at it. That's right. So an incredible service, again, provided by Roy to create this asset to make it available then for the world. And there's Roy and Logan. So thank you all for that. Now, in addition to Roy's critical service work by Maureen, I already credited the SFU Library Scholarly Digitization Fund and Don Taylor. Thank you, Don. Ian Song, who I had a chance to thank personally this morning as he wandered by the archaeology department, seeking cover from debris and falling waters and other construction-related activities. Kevin Stranick and Allison Moore, both here. Obviously, other helpers, Clayton Crawford, Merrill, Peter Locker, and Shannon Wood in the Department of Archaeology, and Josh Fontaine, who's taking care of our videography also today, help with this project. It's a big piece of work in a lot of ways, but really most of the burden fell to the library staff. We're really grateful to archaeology for that. And we're also grateful to you all in the library and Allison for helping set up this event, provide this space, and actually help us, buy some booths. So, which is probably the most important thing in so many ways to archaeologists and library. Anyway, so lots and lots of hope for that. So, with all of that, let me just tell you what we're planning on doing here for the rest of the day. Is I'm going to turn over, I don't have a microphone, but Roy can pick up a microphone if he wants to, and make remarks about SFU Archaeology Press and how it got to be the way it is. Then next up, Kevin Stranick, an non-archaeologist and non-anthropologist on the panel to share insights about how the existing catalog and prospects for Archaeology Press 2.0 fit within SFU's evolving plans for open access and digital publishing. Speaking about open access and digital publishing, Paula Thorogood is here, live via digital interface from her office in Victoria. Thank you to Paula for making time. She's the acting director of the BC Archaeology branch, and I've asked her to update us all on continuing investments by the provincial government in creating tools to further the purposes of the Heritage Conservation Act through the data and reports cataloging. More live in-person action in the office there. So Paula will also share whatever comments she has on pathways towards partnerships with the professional community and across professional lines into the academic community, etc. So, continuing then for some time on professional partnership themes, I'm pleased also to hail the triumphant return to SFU by Chimi Rujasinghe, the president of the BC Association of Professional Archaeologists. BC APA has a good history of deliberation concerning the role of the organization in encouraging publication by its members, and she'll offer comments about that. Next up, Christopher Dole is an adjunct member of the faculty here at SFU and a core member of the program faculty for the HRM program, the professional program. He's the past president of the Register of Professional Archaeologists. No, the president-elect of the Register for Professional Archaeologists, which I think means you have to even be a little nicer to him somehow than president-elect. Past president's like, oh well, so what? So anyway, I've asked Chris to help us put this conversation into continental and global context. How about that? As well as share perspectives on some of the interface of the business world between publishing and archaeology. Roy Carlson, a super valuable colleague here in SFU Archaeology, professor in the department and a Canada Research Chair with us here. To hold up the bio-anthro end of things in the conversation, but also because Mark is one of the most avid publishers and one of the people in the department who publishes the most across disciplinary lines, using the most different kinds of media to get his work out there. So it's exciting that he's able to join us in the great forum. Mark's also very shy, I think you'll find, and reticent, so you'll often need to direct questions specifically to say almost anything. So, last, and certainly not least, is George Nichols. Our recently crowned good King George, the new head of the Department of Archaeology, new chair here, who George and Chris, Dave Maxwell, and also Dave Burley are the principal architects of this HRN program and are also responsible for a lot of the success that has made it possible for us to be here today, representing SFU Archaeology with such a great crew of colleagues here. So thank you very much. I've asked all of the panelists to, kind of give us 4 to 6 minutes of their pithiest talks, continue the introduction of themselves, and then we will open it up for deliberation with you all. So save your comments and questions, unless there's a clarification point needed, in which case shoot up a hand and I'm sure somebody will recognize you. I'm going to not have my face towards you, but somebody here will probably take pity on you. So that's enough out of me. Roy, have at it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John. Well, John asked me to give you a brief talk about the origins of Archaeology Press. So I thought what I would try to do was place it in historical context. And as you know, SFU opened in 1965. There was no plan to have any archaeology at all. But then they hired me as an archaeological anthropologist to develop the archaeology and anthropology of the Pacific Northwest. So that's essentially what I tried to do. Every anthropology department I had previously been associated with was involved in a publication program. University of Washington, University of Arizona, University of Colorado, all of them put out monographs in anthropology and archaeology. And so in 1971, when 3 of us who were here at the time, that is Phil Holder, Herb Alexander, and myself, got this grant of $50,000, which was a lot of money in 1971. So we started, had put forth a proposal for, a salvage program. And so we had projects going throughout the province to testing in the archaeological sites and to see what needed to be salvaged. And so when this was completed, reports were written. So I thought, let's put them out as a publication. And I was, chair of the department at the time. So we had a little money that could be used for that purpose. And so we mimeographed the first report, which was Salvage 71, which is, I think there's a copy over on the table over there. It's a long out of print. And from there we went on, publishing theses, compendiums of research projects, and textbooks. That in those days, they used to give faculty credit for teaching, not just for research. You could get promoted and get tenure. You maybe couldn't make full professor, but for teaching, and certainly producing textbooks is part of teaching. The first one put out was Knut Plagmark's A Manual of Field Archaeology, which has been used all over North America and certainly brought SFU more recognition than a lot of other things. And then the next one was the one that Mark Skinner and put together on physical anthropology, a guide really for found human remains. That also sold as well. And then Debbie Cannon's her Manual of Fish Osteology, which is how to identify fish bones. And those were really essentially textbooks. Other things were used in textbooks. The Northwest Coast Indian Art Traditions, which I put together after a conference here in the 70s, also was used as a textbook in a number of American universities. And again, of all our publications, it's these three textbooks which have actually brought in the most money to support publication of the research monographs. So that was now the research monographs, why publish? I think there are really two reasons. One is to get ideas out there. The other is to get data out there. And the research monographs contain ideas and data. The reasons for publishing all of this is so your colleagues can evaluate how you're using your data to support your conclusions, and how your colleagues can also use the data that you put out there for their own comparison. Now, the comparative method is really, goes clear back into Boasian anthropology. And again, most of the research monographs of Boas and his students put out were really ethnographic. Whereas, how much real ethnography are you going to get anymore? So, what archaeology was doing was adding to the database there. And Archaeology Press is really a product of the expansion of Canadian archaeology in the 1960s, which continued on in the 70s. The expansion of Canadian archaeology at that time really, I think, began with the establishment of the Department of Archaeology at the University of Calgary. Dick Corbus and Scotty Phoenician there. Also, with the establishment of the Archaeological Survey of Canada in Ottawa, which really is a product that Gordon MacDonald was instrumental in. Now, again, SFU, they had no plans for an archaeologist, but they got me. So, I decided, well, we should do archaeology, which we did. We always felt that archaeology was a field science. You need to get your data out there. It's really a continuation of the Boasian tradition of getting data. Boas was mostly interested in having data, and he was instrumental in publishing that. Now, archaeology is really not a social science story. You don't read stuff. Study some of the projects of societies and other factors that enter into the underlying record. Anyway, from there on, archaeology continued really to expand up through the 80s. For a while, we had our own shirt committee. Now a lot of archaeology in Canada, most of our data is out here. Some of us are still working on getting things out, so we'll see what happens in the future. But do we really need to publish hard copy? You know, this is the electronic revolution. In D. Gordon Child's term, it is a revolution, I'll tell you. So I just wonder if we need to put out hard copies anymore. We put out the data in our research monographs. We use the various archaeological journals to get our ideas out there with reference back to the research monographs. I'm not sure hard copies are still necessary. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, I think you just answered our question about whether or not you could hear okay, because you were clapping. Yes, you can hear.
Okay, good, thank you very much. Kevin?
All right, over to me. All right, I'll take this over. I'm Kevin Strennick, and I work with the SFU library here. We've got a new digital publishing division that I'm part of. And I have to say that over the past few months, working with John, Aaron, it's been like an incredible part of the archaeology family here at SFU. It's been so much fun to work with both of you. But with this collection in particular and with Roy's work, when I first heard about the collection as it existed as a print collection from Jenna Walsh there, the archaeology librarian sitting back, and let me know that there was this amazing collection of work in the library. All of these monographs that are one of a kind, representations of research and data gathering. And there was an interest in maybe doing something more with them. And as John mentioned, Don Taylor at the Digitization Center stepped up to take all of these print copies, run them through our Digitization Center here at the library, and turn them all into electronic books. And we were able to then take those books and put them into our own publishing platform and make those available to the world. And to be even a small part of the work that Roy's done over all of these years, and to know that the library's helping to boost the availability of this material, to make this material available to anybody, anywhere who has an internet connection, to be able to have access to it, is critical importance to the library. And it's one of our real core goals, is to be able to take this kind of critical work that's done at SFU and elevate it and make it available and share it with anybody who would like to have access to it. I wanted to give you just a little bit of background on the library's activities in this area. A lot of people might not be familiar with how much we've been doing in digital publishing for more than a decade now. I'm not sure people have heard of the Public Knowledge Project. Some of you, one or two of you. We have some pins in the back. You got a free PKP pin. And PKP came to SFU in 2005. It's a research project that's interested in how can we make more of the knowledge that we talked about earlier today public. How can we make that publicly available? How can we as a university and a research community connect with civil society, with people who aren't up here on the mountain on this ivory tower, but how can we actually have a discussion with those folks? How can we show them the relevance of the work that we do and the discoveries we make? And one of the challenges that we ran into in the Public Knowledge Project was so much of this work is behind a paywall. And you might have this great study, and somebody who's not associated with the university would really benefit from reading that. They could learn about it, advance their own work as a professional. And you send them a link, say, in this electronic environment, and the link asks them to pay $45 to rent that article for 24 hours. That's the kind of barrier that, as librarians, that's too much. I mean, we have to do something about that. So the Public Knowledge Project at SFU Library set about understanding why those barriers were in place, because there's certainly costs to publishing. But what could we do? What could we contribute to make publishing even more efficient, to help move things online, to help bring those costs down, to make more of this kind of research material freely available? So we created free open source software that anybody in the world can download and use, and they can set up their own journals, they can set up their own presses for monograph publishing, and they don't have to pay us a dime. And as of today, we know that there's at least 10,000 journals now around the world that are using our software to publish. Over half of them in the developing world. These are a lot of folks who would never be publishing if it weren't with open source software that SFU's developed. So it's something we're pretty proud of. I did a quick Google search just to try to take a look. There's 10,000, it's a lot to know exactly what's going on. But I found a nice handful of archaeology journals. I found West African Journal of Archaeology from Nigeria, Paleo-Indian Archaeology from Latvia, Computer Applications and Quantitative Methods in Archaeology from Norway, the Journal of Pacific Archaeology from New Zealand, Archaeologica Baltica, that's closer to the other one, Lithuania, Journal of Neolithic Archaeology from Germany, History, Archaeology, Ethnology from Georgia, country, not the state. So archaeology's got a representation in that work that we do too. And for us to have the opportunity to not only make the software, but work with content like Roy's from our home base of SFU and put that onto our platform was a one-of-a-kind opportunity that we've just been so thrilled to work on. Let me not go on and on about some of these things. I want to say some of the directions that we're going with our own work in the library is to work with SFU faculty who are working with journals to help them use our software, put their journals online, and hopefully make them freely available. We're also working with students. We've probably got about 8 student journals where the students set up their own journal, they peer review each other's work, and then publish it, make it freely available if they will. So we're helping them learn how to be future scholars and how to share freely as future scholars. We're working in the classroom with faculty who are using course journals. All the students will submit their papers into the system. They peer review within the classroom, and then they get revisions, quite likely, and then they get shared out to the world so people can see what's going on in SFU classrooms and the kinds of innovative teaching that's going on here in our community. I'd also just like to mention, too, that it's not just SFU. We've got a lot of partners nationally that we're working with. We're working with a lot of stakeholders in Canadian publishing, with the library community, but also with the academic and research community, with the journal publishing community, and with the funders as well. With groups like SHRP, we've got a great grant from CFI, the Canadian Foundation of Innovation, to help advance our work, to make it even more useful to all of you who are involved in publishing and want to take advantage of the kinds of software programs that we're offering. Now that's a lot of sort of talk. What I did also want to do, in addition to talking at you for a bit, was to give you a bit of a demo. You alluded to the new Arc Press, but let's take a look. If any of you got your phones, you can access it now. I have to go in behind. Sorry, Paul, I'm going to stand behind you.
That's great.
And the URL is arcpress.lib.sfu.ca. Let's bring it up on the big screen. So there it is, SFU Archaeology Press. This is using our open monograph press software, so it's all free and open source, but we're running this here at the library. Let's take a look at the catalog. And Roy, you're going to recognize a lot of these covers. So this is the collection now that's been completely digitized.
Important, at least in part, because some of these titles are out of print otherwise.
Let's pull one of these up. Here's Marpole, Dave's work. And you can see, in addition to the synopsis, we've got all of the links. So the complete book is here as a PDF, but then all of the different components, if you just want a chapter. And, you know, if you still want to get a hard copy, you can still go here to print and purchase a print copy. We'll ship that out to you. We'll go through those as long as there are print copies available at least. Some of these don't go back quite so far. Things like Toolstone Geography was published in 2015. And again, if you look through, all the different contributors are all listed here. And you can click on that link, and there's their chapter. want to get fancy, there's social media tools, so you can share these on Facebook, you can tweet about it, whichever is your sort of social media preference, take advantage of that. But I do want to also point out that this work is licensed under a Creative Commons license, which means the owners, the authors, still own it, the press still owns it, but we're agreeing to share it with the world. So other people can download it and use it, they can use it in a classroom, they don't have to ask permission. It's available everywhere, and that's something that we're pretty pleased to be making available. Now I should also mention, in addition to this being a catalog that displays the content, if that's not fabulous enough, it is also a full editorial system. So authors can create accounts, they can submit a manuscript for consideration using the system. It can be peer reviewed, editors can go through it, make a decision as to whether they want to accept it or not. There's a copy editing phase and a production phase where the PDFs are made, and ultimately publication. So it's got a whole workflow behind it as well. And it's taking advantage of that workflow that we're thinking about could be a big part of an ArcPress 2.0. And how could we sustain the work that Roy started on a platform like this that could invite others to share their work through the platform? And that might be part of student projects or others would be interested in contributing. So I think that's going to be part of the discussion that hopefully we can have today too, even if we've got a couple of beers and us we can really figure out where this is going to go. But there it is, arcpress.lib.sfu.ca.
There it is,
Works
take it.
there for everybody. There it is, take it. Let me bring back the slides. And that's it, Ken.
That is your clue, Paula.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Excellent, thanks. It looks as though there's a lot of you. I can really mostly see the back of Roy's head, but it looks good from here. So do apologize. And as things have been going on, you'll notice I'm looking and I'm just taking some notes. So thank you very much for having us. Thank you for having us. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person when we looked at the logistics. We hoped and we're thankful that teleconference is a pale comparison to being there in person, but at least we can participate. So as the manager of the branch, I support the director and oversee the permitting and inventory sections. Permitting, administer permits, read reports, and investigate alleged contraventions to the Heritage Conservation Act. And the inventory section manages the Provincial Heritage Register, the 50,000 some odd recorded archaeological sites in BC. And they also respond to most queries from the public regarding the presence of archaeological sites on their properties. We can only really provide information for properties to specific members of the public. So you can ask about your property, you can't ask about your neighbors. We do get that from some people. We do process approximately 400 permits annually. We recently noted that at this time in 2015, we've had 277 applications. And now, right this week, this year, we're at 470. So there's been a huge increase in volume, which means that there's a lot of great work being done, I'm assuming. Submission of site records and reports are part of permit obligations, and our jurisdiction is limited to provincial jurisdiction. So federal land, like reserves or port authorities, or land linked to operations for railroads, wouldn't necessarily, or wouldn't be subject to permitted work. We accept non-permit reports, but presently they are kept within the branch. We are looking at options of ways to share that externally. And I think we've done it in the past, but it's just one of the things that we're looking at. However, for other reports that are under provincial jurisdiction and have permits, they're available to First Nations, archaeologists, and other parties electronically via PARL, which is the Provincial Archaeological Report Library. We were one of the first provinces to be able to provide this electronically. Previously, people had to mail ask for mailed copies or go specifically to the capital cities or other offices to look for these reports. And also site data is available via RAD, which is the remote access to archaeological data. And access is given to those same parties. RAD has search and spatial components, whereas PARL holds searchable PDFs. There are challenges with RAD, maintaining records in PARL. I could go on for a long time about all of those, but briefly, RAD is based on some old technology. V3 is under development, and I was told today V3 is apace, and hopefully that means that we can have some information to share about that shortly. And PARL is limited to the amount of reports that we're able to put into it. We made a concentrated effort to putting the archaic reports to Queen's printer, particularly with, and these are archaic reports we're referring to work that was so old that we wouldn't normally request changes. These archaic reports are stamped with the notice to say it wasn't subject to branch review, so it's kind of use at your own risk, but with professional reliance and looking at what work was done and acknowledging that sometimes it was done to the standards of the day. At least one person, somebody who's interested in researching a specific area can access those reports. We are looking at getting a new application which would kind of work with both inventory and permitting sections, which was part of the Natural Resource Permitting Project. And that would, have a spatial component, be able to tag into where we would have previous study areas. There's a bunch of information that we've been waiting to release, and with the technological issues associated with RAD, this might be our best way to do it all at once. The other part about records is that we need to balance sharing information with sharing good information. For example, 8 of trusted external users, people who've been doing a lot of site forms, were able to enter data directly onto the register. And some of that work continues to be good, and some of that work probably should have been reviewed a little bit sooner. We also have the issue of 80-20, where 20% of the work requires 80% of your time to review and get it to a place where it's appropriate. And then everybody would benefit from having that version published. At the Arc Branch, we have several roles to play with the protection of heritage resources in BC, operating within the legislation of the Heritage Conservation Act, from authorizing work to acting as the repository for information. In reviewing applications, we ensure that, or we review proposed scope and methods of assessments and proposed impacts to archaeological sites. Included in that review, we consider the qualifications and eligibility of archaeologists. That is, one of those considerations is who's been handing in information and how good was it. I really appreciated the reminder that the AP members, of which there's a published list, have the mandate to provide reports in a timely manner. We also have written things into our applications to ensure that reports, site forms are submitted quickly. We have had a number of situations where, we were ready to authorize work only to find out from a third party, in some cases the First Nation, that something significant had been identified but not yet reported. So we do encourage people to contact the branch, even if it's, something important. An email letting us know, oh hey, the report's forthcoming, but I just wanted to let you know I got out of the field today and we saw this. That's good for us to know, especially if we're making other decisions that archaeologists might not necessarily be involved in. We do review reports, confirm work is sufficient, particularly if additional impacts are anticipated and there's further assessment or further permits required. And acknowledging that we're a common resource to people interested in archaeology in BC. We're committed to staying abreast of methods and theories, and so access to this journal is really exciting news. So thank you very much.
Paula, could we just ask you, while we're going through the rest of the panel comments, to mute yourself on your end, if that's possible through your software?
Yes, I can, and I'll just try to remember not to unmute myself, so if it looks like I'm talking, let me know and
I'll do a funny little dance. I'll do a funny little dance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Archaeology Singer. I'm the vice president of the BCAPA. I've been a consulting archaeologist for the last 12 years. Some of the challenges that we find in getting our information and reporting out has to do with the relationships between the client and First Nations parties involved in our projects. So, for example, the Golden Years project, the bridge project, was conducted by a First Nations-run company, the KC Development Corporation, now currently called KC Development Limited Partnership. They were able to produce a lot of articles and information about that project and the Wapato Village site and everything that came along with that. But on most of our general projects, we're unable to share a lot of information because the client restricts it, or the First Nations communities that we're working with are not interested in having information about spiritual landmarks or cultural things disseminated to the public. And so I find that when chatting with my friends who are in academics and chatting with folks in consulting, there's a lot of gap in information that we should be able to share, but we're unable to because of our commitments and obligations to the projects that we're working on. But like Paula had mentioned, having access to Parl and RAD really helps us consultants, have access to reports about projects in the area and understand a lot more information that we wouldn't easily be able to get our hands on. And now with having the digital platform, we can add more to our reporting, even though chances are the client's not going to read any of it. It's more just to give them the fuller story and give them a wider picture beyond their development itself.
And even software that can run within publications, and probably most importantly, the data that's included. And this is really critical within our discipline because what we consider to be facts within archaeology aren't always going back to the original data. Through time, our data, our facts, gradually opinions become facts through time. And it's really hard if you've worked with historical collections or on long-term research to be able to actually go back to the very original data. And when people have the opportunity to do that, they come out with much different findings because of this intellectual drift through decades and decades of archaeological work. So the ability now to, on the journal scale, to be able to actually link in or provide the data that article is based upon provides a much better and a stronger science because people can look at that data and actually evaluate the conclusions that you reach in that journal and challenge those if necessary. For beyond the journal level and research monographs, it becomes essential because that's the real foundation of our science. Now, including all that dynamic digital content, it does present some additional archival challenges in migrating those data to ensure that those other types of media can be read in the future. But I think the opportunity is here to really rethink how we present and use data, and it's wide open. So I expect, that we will see completely different types of work products from the work that we do with our discipline. And of course, another huge opportunity is the reach and thus the impact of work. So now global distribution with 2.0, I mean, it's there, right? Changing from a local scale, and archaeology tend to be kind of local and regional, but to get those information products out to across the world inexpensively and instantly. Time is another potential opportunity, although not always. The digitalness doesn't necessarily make the time, but it provides a possibility for faster time to publication and dissemination of data, but it's also dependent upon other things, including the workflow of the actual publication process. And also cost there's an opportunity. So, you essentially eliminate printing, mailing, and warehousing costs, which can be significant, particularly if you're putting out a periodical, to like a membership where you have thousands and thousands of members. That can be prohibitively expensive. But you have to remember, even with digital publishing, that the other costs remain and they don't go away. So those are what I view as some of the opportunities in front of us. Challenges. First, what is open access? Everybody loves it as a buzzword, and everybody wants kind of everything for free, right? But in my way of thinking, open access hasn't really been, or it's not about access. Providing a printed report in a public library or libraries, to me, really is, it's accessible. What I think is really going on here, it's a different business model. And what open access is a fundamental shift in the business model of publishing from a pay-to-read model to a pay-to-publish model. But in either of those, the pay part of that is still there because there are real costs. Some of that within our discipline and their underlying kind of sentiments for that, there's one kind of thought that, well, the data is already paid for. Public money funds a lot of archaeology, and it's either directly publicly funded or it's a part of a public process, therefore data are paid for, and then everything else should be free from that because the project was already kind of paid for. Another kind of underlying sentiment is that archaeology is national or cultural patrimony, and you shouldn't profit at all from that, and all the results from archaeology should be given away because it's held in the public trust. I would push back on that and make the argument that presses actually add value to those original data. And I used to do a fair amount of satellite remote sensing. And I remember trying to lease some satellite data that was it happened to be from Landsat, so the U.S. Publicly funded satellite that was up there taking Earth images and archiving those. And at that time I was a poor graduate student, the cost of licensing those data was pretty expensive for me. And it was like, wait a minute, these data already, the satellite was paid for, it was put up in orbit, all that was paid for, and why are you charging me for those essentially free data? And the answer is that we're not charging you for the data are free. What we're charging you for is our time to go to the archives, to pull those data, to burn them on a CD, to put them in the mail and mail those data to you. So the data were free, but they were value adding those data and their ability to deliver those data to me, which was a value and worth paying for. So I view presses in the same way. I think they add value to our work and to our data by providing a process in which the data and our results and our interpretation of those data are edited, they're promoted, they're distributed, and they're sold. And those are all things that we need as part of the process. Data may be paid for, but we need those other things as well, which aren't paid for. And I also believe that those type of things, that the people who provide those, essentially the presses, should be reimbursed or even profit from their providing those services, those value-added services. As I mentioned, digital publishing doesn't significantly reduce the costs. They do for essentially printing and mailing and warehousing, but the majority of the costs are labor costs. And this kind of leads me into talking a little bit about our changing professional demographics and the publishing business model. So the academic presses and kind of traditional academic business model relies essentially on getting a free product, which is essentially a submitted article or a book or a monograph that is given to the presses essentially for free. Certainly doesn't reflect the number of hours that get put in by authors creating those products. And additionally, particularly with, for example, academic journals and scholarly societies, but also in other presses too, they rely on free labor by the professionals for both reviewing, which can take a tremendous amount of time, and also for editing if you're a volunteer editor like I was for a professional society. And I think that was kind of okay, and that model worked very well 40 years ago when most archaeologists worked within the academy. and we're academic archaeologists. So essentially the free, the quote-unquote free time, because as most of us know, even academics don't do their research like on the job during the day. They're doing their writing and stuff at night. So they're putting in their own time, but in the academic model, that's an investment on the future. The professional reward system within that environment is such that you are investing in your publications, because it's your publications and your research that eventually get you promoted and eventually get you pay increases, and so you get compensated for that. However, today, at least, and I only have data on this from the States, not from Canada, but today approximately 82% of archaeologists work outside of academia, and that changes this whole publication model. And because 82% of archaeologists are working outside of the academy, this more or less, right, we can assume that 82% of the innovations within archaeology that we want to disseminate to our colleagues are also happening outside of academia. However, the professional reward system within government and within private companies for archaeologists doesn't line up with the academic kind of reward system upon which the publishing industry is based. So typically, and I can speak from a career in the private sector primarily, there's almost no professional reward for publishing or for professional service in terms of serving as an editor or volunteering time within the publishing context. So many kind of heritage firms and government agencies even view publishing as a negative aspect to your job, is taking you away from your job and distracting it from it, either from a time point of view within government or within the private sector, which is like you're not generating revenue. Essentially, we're taking our profits to pay you to do something else, and that's not beneficial to our for-profit venture. There are other companies who are kind of in the middle who tolerate it but aren't super excited that people are spending time publishing. And there are a few companies, to their credit, that do encourage their staff to publish and even build in some rewards, typically a publication bonus for you to do that. Now they kind of expect that you're going to do that off the clock on your own time, but at least they recognize it as something that's professionally important to do and will give you a bonus. Now they tend to kind of justify that by advertising, right, which is kind of not an accurate way of really viewing that, and those of you who take my business class will talk about things like that, because the people reading those publications aren't the clients. It's really not advertising. If anything, though, it kind of helps you with recruiting, and it promotes your firm within our industry and makes it a more desirable place for people to work, and that is a good thing. But and I can say as well, for the SAA journal, the Journal of Archaeological Practice that I edited, it was incredibly hard to find reviewers for articles, as well as authors actually for articles from the private sector and from government. But finding reviewers who had the expertise, they were very often within those sectors, but getting them to give up time to participate in that was hard. So that makes me kind of think as well that, although, as John pointed out, and showed slides about our professional values, that publication is an important professional value to us, that is eroding. And unfortunately, I think it's happening both on the publication side, but also even on the consumption, the reading side. Now, if people, they tend to get narrow. They stop reading about broad things and they'll read what's necessary to conduct a project somewhat. But I think people, and particularly people who are really doing a lot of compliance work and less perhaps researchy type work, have really stopped reading our professional literature, and that's super dangerous. And are certainly very few of them are contributing to it. Now that's probably more so at the journal level. We can get into the grade literature problem and where reports go, where like the research monographs go when they don't get published, and that as well, which is another challenge for publishing a professional literature, and one in which a digital option can potentially help out with too. And I don't have answers on how we combat this, but I'm starting to believe that this kind of change in values regarding both the production and consumption of literature results is starting to happen, and something we need to think about in the future. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. John asked me to talk a bit about what's going on in academic research publishing as it pertains to digital publishing in particular. Roy mentioned electronic revolution, and that's obviously been thoroughly embedded in the academic side of things. All the major journals are using digital platforms now. But the open access part of that, I think we are still some way from actually understanding where that's going. So, I mean, my perception, at least in archaeology and bioanth, is that there have been no massive changes in terms of the dominance of certain key traditional journals. We're all creaking under the weight of the amount of material that's been produced and the number of reviews that we're being asked to do, but the actual dominance of the key journals like Journal of Human Evolution, Journal of Archaeological Science, Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, that seems to be persisting at this point. Open access journals have made a splash in both archaeology and bioanth. I think probably more so in bioanth than in archaeology, but it's hit both. But it doesn't seem to me, from what I'm saying, that it's really been embraced as much as we might have expected or hoped or wanted it to be embraced. Certainly open access data has been thoroughly embraced, but open access publishing, I think much less so at this point. So, talking to colleagues at conferences and looking at discussion online, there was initially, and I think there persists, suspicion about open access journals in a number of cases. The problems with predatory journals has obviously been fairly substantial, and it's cast a pall over many of the journals that are out there that are open access, actually, I think. And my sense is that has, people have been quite conservative in both archaeology and bioanth in terms of embracing open access, partly because of that. What runs alongside that is that I think there's a limited number of venues for archaeology and bioanth in the open access domain. So there are very general journals like PLOS One, where we can get papers in without too much difficulty, but there aren't very many sort of specialist open access archaeology and bioanth journals that are considered to be high quality at this point. So that aspect of open access publishing, I think, is something that we have yet to really fully come to grips with, and I don't know where it's going to go. It's quite interesting. I've been surprised in many ways how conservative many of my colleagues are, or our colleagues are, in terms of open access. Some of the things I've heard about journals in the course of conversations at conferences has been pretty surprising. So it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. I think one of the other things that's goes along with that I've actually struggled with myself. I started publishing in open access journals fairly early on. I had a paper in PLOS One the first year it came out, so I got a T-shirt as one of the first year's people. But obviously one of the problems that we're confronted with, and again I don't know how to solve it. I mean, it requires us to pay up front to publish, and yet our grants are obviously inherently limited. So, when we're talking about publishing a journal article that can be, in some cases, $3,000, that's a lot of cash. I mean, that's a fairly decent level of support for a student for a few months. So, we're confronted with this position of, okay, so do I spend the money on getting the article out, or do I spend it on one of my students. Obviously the Open Access Fund at SFU has been a big boon on that front. We get the possibility of publishing with support from SFU, but it's limited, so it's 2 articles a year. It was 4 articles a year when it first started, if I recall correctly. It's now 2 articles a year at 2,500 per journal article, which again is great, but for some journals that's not enough. And you know, if we're aiming obviously to publish more than 2 articles a year, which many of us are, it's a problem. So again, I don't know how to square that circle. Until the government starts making available funds specifically for publishing open access journals, I think we're going to be struggling to switch fully over to open access, and we'll be in this sort of blended situation of traditional journals and open access journals. So again, I don't have any solutions on that front. I think the question is, how do we make high quality open access? And one of the things that I think is really important is for us to persist in our determination for all the stuff we put out, or as much as possible to be peer reviewed. So how do we get high quality peer reviewed open access journals more readily available in the academic domain? That seems to be a sort of major challenge. Again, I don't know how to solve it, but it's something we should be talking about, I think. So that really speaks to what John asked me to talk about. The other thing that he said I could talk about other stuff, so I thought, there is one thing that I want to bring up that hasn't been discussed so far, and I think is really important, which is how we engage with the public. We talk about putting stuff out on open access. You know, it's great, fantastic, it's all available, but who's actually going to read it? You know, realistically, the number of people who are equipped, let alone interested in reading a site report, the number of people who are equipped to read a site report critically, you know, it's going to be very small. And if we want to reach out, we talk about releasing stuff digitally, okay, and somehow magically this makes our research more available. Well, you know, it's a very limited way of thinking about more available, in my view. You know, it's out there, but who's actually going to read it? Are they going to understand it? Are they going to interpret it properly? So I think in many ways an issue that we should be thinking about alongside this question of improving digital access is actually how do we get our research to the public, not just in physical form, but in terms of a way, in terms of how it can be digested by them. You know, we actually need a more sort of intermediary model, I think. There's obviously new types of publishing that have come along with the digital revolution that, again, it's not clear to me where they're going. So things like, you know, blogs and people talking about research. There's a few people in paleoanthropology, for example, who've created very popular blogs and write a lot about research, but it's not clear. You know, there are, you know, people within the discipline are kind of uncomfortable about the dominance of those voices in the discipline, and so there's some uncertainty about where that's going. You know, the other part of it, I think, is kind of something we should think about is how we interface better with science journalists. You know, these are, so we have these people who are writing blogs that people read, the public members of the public read, but the other sort of major go-betweens for archaeology and bioenth are science journalists, and we really, in my view, we really need to think a lot harder about how we interact and how we teach science journalists about our research. I've found over the last few years some pretty astonishing experience. I mean, I sort of, you know, come to think about it in many ways as sort of catch and release. You sort of, you know, you capture the science journalist, you just have to let them go in terms of what they actually end up writing. You have no real control over that, and I've seen some really bizarre things come out of stuff that I've published that I, you know, never would have interpreted that way. Never said that thing to the science journalist, but out it pops anyway. we need as a community of archaeologists and bioanthropologists, in my view, to think a lot harder about how we cope with that interaction with science journalists, how we increase interaction with them, but do so in a way that allows them to actually, or allows us to actually teach them about what we do. And I think that needs to be part of this discussion about expanding access through digital means, because we, again, realistically, members of the public aren't going to sit down and read a paper from Journal of Archaeological Science or Journal of Human Evolution, and most of them aren't going to understand it, or take away the wrong message, or they won't persist in trying to read it. So we actually do need these people to interface for us, or for us to learn how to interface with the public. So I think, to me, that's another important part of this sort of opening the access to research needs to involve some thought about that side of things. Thank you.
I'd like to speak about publishing relative to responsibility. And there's three different types of responsibilities that I point to here. One is responsibility that we have to colleagues, to the discipline. The second is to students, and the third is to the public, picking up on Mark's latter point. And I preface these remarks with telling you something about myself. That I'm the former editor of the Canadian Journal of Archaeology. I'm the former editor of the Research Handbooks in Archaeology series published by the World Archaeological Congress. I'm the former member of the editorial board of American Antiquity. I've published many articles, I've edited a number of books. I currently review manuscripts for journals and book publishers. I do about 10 a year at this point. And all of this started when I published as a 19-year-old second-year college student my first book review. And when I was a master's student, I published my first book chapter. And when I was a PhD student, I published my first book. And all of this was a result of the faculty mentoring that I had. My BA supervisor, Howard Sargent, was editor of the journal. We need to encourage our students to look for opportunities to publish, whether they're an undergrad or grad student. Book reviews are a great starting point. But also think about how much time many of our students have put into conference presentations at local or national or international conferences. They put weeks or months of effort into something that has an audience for 15 minutes of maybe 50 people, maybe 100 people. But with some effort, they could use that conference paper as a springboard and reach hundreds or thousands as a result of that. And so I think that we have a response, and there's a real payoff in terms of building your career, advancement through your graduate career when the universities or the department is looking to differentiate students in handing out awards. We have great students, but some are very active, some publish, and that actually counts for the ranking of our students. So what I've spoken to so far is the responsibility that we have to the discipline in the case of, and it's a point that Chris made, that it's really hard to find reviewers for manuscripts. And this is something that a lot of us have shied away from, but I think this is an absolute requirement that each of us have to put our expertise to the test of reviewing others' work to ensure that what gets published in the end is as good as it could or should be. The second is responsibility that we have to our students. And the third is responsibility that all of us have to the public. Now, the title of the session is Publish Archaeology. But I would complete that by saying publish archaeology or archaeology perishes. This is a huge concern that we as a discipline have continued to do not a good job of engaging with the public, of taking our remarkable scholarship and explaining to or putting some value on it beyond our learned colleagues. And this is a point that Mark, very, very nicely made. When we're looking at the work that we do or our students do, whether it be on new approaches to edge angle analysis or whatever the case may be, one thing I always encourage my students to do is then ask, so what? Beyond writing for a number of technologically oriented colleagues in this case, what does anyone else get out of this? And I think that, with some care in expressing the value of the importance of such research, however technical it is, we are doing our discipline of service, but we're also engaging with the public and saying, this is what you need to know, and this is why you should be funding this kind of work, because it makes a difference in understanding human diversity past and present, or whatever it is that we are ultimately engaged with. So ultimately, we have a responsibility at all of these different levels, and Archaeology Press is now going through a transformation process, and I think there are some great opportunities here, not only for us within the department to take advantage of our remarkable scholarship and publish as faculty members, as students and so on, but hopefully to attract others, and especially to attract kinds of publications or monographs that may have difficulty in finding an outlet through more traditional presses. So I think we have a really bright future ahead of us. I think we still have a lot of homework to do in terms of how do we set up this next iteration of Archaeology Press 2.0. But I think this gathering that John has organized is an opportunity for a first of many conversations about this, and to gather your ideas for how do we do this, how do we do it well, and what needs can we fulfill through this press to the discipline, to our students, and especially to the public. Thank you.
And there it is. Take it. Comments or questions for the panel, or comments back to one another? I have one that I'd like to just start, use this prerogative of mine, because Cheney, I feel like we didn't maybe give you all of the stage that we wanted you to have. Are there conversations within the BCAPA professional community about asking particular clients? I'm thinking especially of some of the bigger ones, transportation and BC Hydro, for example, to push them a little bit for moving some of the information collected under their aegis and sponsorship into the public domain, of finding ways to present more about those kinds of projects. I've seen some of it.
Yeah.
I just want to know kind of what the future holds in that area.
It's limited because it's such a complicated partnership. It's not just the client, but it's also the nations involved in the project. So if everyone's on the same page, then yes, there is more information that is made public through presentations and publications. But we're finding that it's challenging trying to meet their budget constraints as well. So that's kind of where we are right now in a lot of work.
And so what do we do to get them to provide more money? I'm thinking about the limited example that we know from Arizona. Chris will know about this as well, and Dave Maxwell to a certain extent, where it was really one person inside the Department of Transportation that said, this is ridiculous. Nobody knows anything about this incredible work that's coming out as a result of millions and billions spent on archaeology across the U.S., and made it her priority to make sure that there was going to be a public component to every CRM project sponsored by Arizona Department of Transportation. What do we do? Who do we talk to?
I think it's mostly client by client base, and I can speak to the Golden Years Bridge project because there is a lot of public education that came out of that, where the members of Casey First Nation even go into the public schools and talk about the project and all its various components of the large village site that was found there, and bridge here, but at one point this was a huge village site. This is like of great value to not just that nation, but all the nations in the neighboring territories. But it's still in its early stages, and it's a lot of baby steps. The BCAPA, we have a public education committee, and through that committee we do try to engage the public with various talks and discussions. Most of it is currently through people that contact the association to see if an archaeologist can come in and talk to the schools. So we're starting at with catching people at a tender age to get them interested and get them aware of a lot of things within their community. And we're finding that a lot of the teachers ask for more information, so they try to bring that into their classrooms as well.
Terrific. And Tom, I saw you had your hand up, but Paula, you turned your mute off, so did you have a comment?
Just what I was going to say, in some situations we're dealing with the archaeological information, the First Nations don't want it to be necessarily shared publicly in terms of location, because we do get a fair number of reports of pot hunting, for lack of a better word, or unauthorized artifact collection.
Sure.
So that's the other side of the coin is, one of the things that we get from BC Parks a lot is like, well, how do we protect these resources? And we're like, well, sometimes you can hide them in plain sight and you can make reference to them. Like I know the park near my house says, well, there is an archaeological site here and here's a few things about it, but it doesn't say, and it's located right over 5 steps to the left and runs for 100 meters.
Good, thank you. Oh, Roy has a comment.
Well, I agree. You have to get everyone on the same page before you can do this. The traditional Northwest Coast culture, knowledge is owned by individuals, by bands, by tribes. It is owned, and they may not want any of it out there. So you have to work around that.
Oh, good, that's right. Tom, you had a hand up.
Hi, Kevin. I was just going to ask you a question. I noticed when I was on the Arc Press website, there's no DOIs for the chapters or anything. So what do you have any plans for link permanents or getting DOIs?
Great question. The DOIs are there.
Okay.
They're just not exposed yet. And that's just a change that I'm waiting for on the software from our developers that'll make them actually visible. So they're coming.
Great answer, great question. Dennis and then Sean, that's right.
Just a question for Mark. You alluded, when you were talking, you alluded to some sense of distrust, at least among some of our colleagues, of open access. And you also mentioned something about predatory practices. Could you expand a little bit on those?
Yeah, so there's obviously, I mean, you will have gotten these, I'm sure, many of these emails saying, invite you to submit a paper to, whatever it is, the physiological, chemical, something or other.
International physical.
Internet. And there's obviously been, reports in newspapers about, people publishing fake papers in open access journals. And my impression from talking to people at conferences and conversations online is that that's had a real effect, knock-on effect, in terms of how people view open access publishing across the board. That's not an entirely consistent response, but it's been a noteworthy response, I think, that some often quite senior people in the field have expressed publicly some concern about that and have stuck very rigidly to publishing in the standard journals. So I don't know, well, you obviously know Marina's now down in South Africa working on Rising Star. Right. So that Rising Star group have been pushing open access publishing. And the response within the community has been pretty mixed. I mean, so there are people in a more sort of senior, traditionally minded have not responded especially well in some cases to the fact that they're publishing an open access publisher.
So the concern is
that it's not done properly, that the controls aren't there.
Peer review
Well, you know, either they're circumventing peer review or the peer review isn't as good because they're paying for it. I mean, they're understandable concerns. I don't think they're legitimate in this case. But that feeling is out there, and I don't know how we overcome it other than, you know, by people dying and moving on. But,
I gotta just tell a quick story about this, which is, you know, when it was first sort of hitting you and you got all these emails, I was like, okay, I'm all in for open access, makes great sense. So I say, sure, I'm interested. And they wrote back and they said, okay, so it's gonna cost you, you know, $3,958 or whatever. And so I was like, oh, that's a lot of money. I better make sure this is the right kind of place to publish. I look it up, it's like, no, this is clearly not a solvent publication thing. I wrote it back and said, no, thank you very much. And they wrote back and said, oh, how about $100? So everything has its price. So, Sean.
Oh, Sean, can I just get you this thing?
Is that turned on?
And then
Yeah.
you're next, I believe.
It's just for Paula.
Hey, is this on?
no.
It's just so Paula can hear you.
Oh, Paula, can you hear me? I'm
Yeah.
glad you're here. This is pertaining to you. We're talking about 82% of archaeologists outside the academy that are doing their work. We're talking about the constraints that surround consulting and publishing. If there is community buy-in, some of the
The only person who can hear is
Oh.
Paula.
If there is community buy-in, which we talked about, Roy alluded to ownership, and you have support of the community, and there are constraints for consultants to publish, is there a way to leverage legislation, the archaeology branch, to encourage proponents who are paying for this research to put money and time into publishing so this information gets out there? There are sensitivities to locations, but there are stories behind the artifacts that we can tell, and there can be alternative views brought in from the community to help shape that narrative. Do you think there's ways to go top down from the province to encourage that? Because most of the archaeologists that work consult and publish on their own time with communities without that kind of funding support. Question ended.
Okay, it came in and out, and it was a while, so hopefully I get to address all of your parts, Sean. So, is there an appetite to change the legislation to force publication? At this point, I would say probably not, given that we don't have a universal push for that. As Roy mentioned, you know, owner information can be owned, right? And with the 200 plus First Nation groups, we're getting a lot of different opinions. So I don't think that's universal at the moment to spark a legislative change. That said, I've been wrong at least once before. But in terms of pressuring for I don't know if we would necessarily write it into an application for a permit, but one of the things for accommodation that First Nations may seek when in the course of these major projects is to request funding or public education for the project. I know some projects, the First Nations requested their own education, not their own education, but access to the risk course as part of like an economic incentive as well as an education for how to conduct archaeological work within their own territories. So one of the other things that might take place is to say, okay, well, we would like to see, you know, a summary of what was done here, and we would like to see it provided to our group, and in the course of making that presentation, that might lend itself nicely where you've already spent a lot of time putting it into plain language and putting together all the photos and stuff, making that a lot easier to transition to a publishing venue. And then also having the support of the First Nations to share that information out. Is that sort of address what you were asking, Sean?
Yeah, I just think it's going to be, we're talking about publishing and engaging the public. We're going to have to find ways to do all this work. It seems esoteric and never gets out there. And there's so much money put towards it that I feel like we need consultants in some ways. We don't have the free time always to put time towards that in the academy. There needs some support or leverage in a way to sponsor that kind of dissemination, especially when relationships are being built with communities, and you do see on the ground need for those stories to be shared.
Yeah, about 5% of our permits are research permits. The rest of them are more closely assigned to development. Kind of my point being, like, that might be something that is raised through accommodation by the First Nation, especially if they're interested in having it shared. And that's sort of a discussion, if that's happened, if there's an agreement in place, then we would like to know about that as part of our decision-making process. We're like, oh, okay, well, this has been agreed upon, then finding out about it would be great. Because there's a lot of conversations that we're not involved in. We are regulating whether or not an archaeological impact assessment is going to take place and what that's going to look like.
Yeah, they have to be nation or components of the nation.
Yeah, and there's so much overlapping territory, and then you're going to consider, well, who's going to have whose story is being told.
Sure.
This young lady in the back has.
Oh, sorry.
Very good.
I'm Julie Jones. I'm a librarian here at SFU Library, and I really appreciated the comments about interfacing with journalists. And since I have you all here, I thought this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I do agree that it's a crucial piece of the puzzle. So I thought I'd conduct an informal poll and ask how many people have had the opportunity to interface with journalists.
Have you done your ethics review form?
I'm not. I should have waited until the beer was being served. Okay, and then how many people found it to be a positive experience?
Depends on which one.
You need to nuance that.
Very mixed.
Some positive, some negative.
Yeah. I guess, yeah. I mean, okay. So it's somewhere a bit of both. Okay, thanks.
The third category is how many have taken it in their own hands and written public, open access,
public facing,
and, fully accessible language summaries of work and so forth. And I think that's a really important thing. So if you wait around for a journalist to take interest in your work, you may wait a while.
Yeah.
Do you find we have like external affairs here, at SFU? Do they come into your lives?
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
We've just finished, I'm Dave Burley, and I was the former chair, and I was involved in the production of this. And we just finished, we do a biennial report on the department every 2 years, and it lists all the publications, all the research projects, it gives biographies of the faculty, lots of pictures, easy to read stuff. We normally produce about 5 or 6 hard copies, and the rest will go on. It's not up there yet, I don't think, but the biennial report is about 100 pages. It will go online and with all of the other biennial reports. We sent one of the hard copies this year to SFU Communications, the people you just talked about, and they sent it back.
So we're not sure
So,
why you said that.
we're not sure why they sent it back. We thought they might be interested in terms of generating perhaps a story on one of the faculty or some of the awards that people have gotten.
There's news there.
There's news there,
Yeah.
but they sent it back. So,
Okay.
just to qualify how we get along with it.
So I've had much better experience just pursuing journalists myself.
Interesting. Okay.
So I, just pester them.
Find work that's done by journalists that you appreciate. And then contact them and say, this is what I'm doing. I think it's an excellent point. And I think we're going to close because I don't see too many other hands going, but I hope John's going to have the last comment. But I wanted to just say that I did actually make a slide speaking to Chris's point about, yes, there's sort of open access publishing as opposed to the snazzy, dynamic, interactive opportunities that exist out there. Our fundamental view of associated with the initiative to get SFU, Arch Press, to persist one way or another was that it was going to be better to have one and not need one, than to need one and not have one. So, there you go. John.
I've only done 2 field projects at UBC, but in both cases, we found a way to get the information back to all the folks interested in the way that they wanted. In one case, working with Casey, they asked for a set of mobile displays that they could tape public events and talk about their history. And I'm not sure they still got them, but they used those for many years. In another case, I worked with Treaty 80, and they wanted access to the actual academic literature they couldn't get because it's all behind firewalls. And so we went to the publishers and got permission to reproduce all of the material, both in hard copy and online, and then wrote prefaces to each of the academic papers saying, why did you write this paper, what were the main conclusions, and then we added a whole bunch of other stuff that was sort of relevant to people understanding and seeing archaeology as normal professionals. I think it might be interesting for everybody to write into their budget a couple of percent on getting that information back to the interested public or the interested First Nation.
Well, you know that now major projects offices in the National Science Foundation have public education components that are required, and it's part of the project evaluation, the proposal evaluation. So, and that's going to become, I think, more important as things go on.
Oh, I just have one more. I think.
I have a question.
Oh.
Or comment.
I guess you're the last one.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
I was gonna say, I do agree that writing it into the budget is a good idea. I mean, the information's available. It's the best way to put it out, whether it be onto, a peer-reviewed or some other mechanism that's going to reach more people than just a report and file. Writing that in is a great idea, and hopefully, people evaluating those proposals will consider the value of that, not just look at the dollar value.
Great point.
So we're gonna have one last one and then food and drink?
Yes, exactly right.
I don't want to go from reception, and Chad, thank you so much for the panel. It's really interesting. My name is Rebecca Justin, and I'm also a librarian here. I just want to pick up on a point that Brian was just making about negotiating with publishers to get rights to share. Even if you're not publishing in a fully open access journal, when you sign your copyright transfer agreement, you can negotiate your rights to deposit a copy, essentially a particular version of that article, and make it openly available that way. And you can do that through the SFU Request for Research Repository, which is called Summit. And earlier this year, SFU passed an open access policy that actually does ask people who are producing research here at SFU to self-archive a copy of their work. So that persistent stable link will be available to put back to the other communities that you're working with as well. So there are some parts about the policy there. I'm happy to answer questions about it too. But I did want to use the opportunity to just mention that there is another route to making your work openly available is to deposit a copy. Yeah. Or separate.
Great final note. Thank you so much. So, final thank you to our panelists and also to the library and to the HRM program for hosting the receptions here. So, one more final. There it is.